These next few weeks we're going to be covering the Baroque period, which took place from roughly 1600 to 1750. Baroque originally comes from a Portuguese word meaning irregular in shape, which was sort of a derogatory term at first. It started out as a term of disapproval. Of course, we don't think of Baroque as a negative thing anymore. Musically, it designates the chronological period from 1600 to 1750 and the style of music that came out of that time. Though style is exemplified at its best by the late Baroque composers, including J.S. Bach, George Frederick Handel, and Vivaldi. These are the giants of the Baroque. So I'd like to show you some images, and then we'll get to some of the musical features from the Baroque period. Baroque music was dominated by Italian ideals. From the mid-16th to mid-18th century, Italy was the most influential musical region in Europe. And as you'll see a little bit later, opera was born there as well. European courts were important centers of music. The most imposing was the court of Louis XIV at the Palace of Versailles. This place drips with money. Its architecture, sculptures, and paintings symbolized its wealth and power. The model for absolute monarchy was set by Louis XIV, who regarded himself as synonymous with the whole nation of France. He said, "I am the state." Versailles is breathtaking. It's absolutely gigantic and symmetrical, as you can see. It has more than 1,000 rooms, including a hall that's lined entirely with mirrors. Louis XIV was called the Sun King. Anyway, it's just big, and not just the building, but the grounds outside. You can see where they're geometrically organized. There's long rows of trees, pools, and elegant gardens, which go on for miles. In fact, my really good friend lives in this town, and apparently the gardens are bigger than the town itself. You can really get lost in there. Also imposing is St. Peter's in Rome. This is the biggest church in the world. And the open space in front of the basilica, which you see here, was designed by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in the 1600s. Bernini designed this Piazza San Pietro under the direction of Pope Alexander VII as this place where the greatest number of people could see the Pope give his blessing. Here's another picture. It's a little blurrier, but I like it because this was taken actually with a disposable camera. It was taken when we were in Rome visiting our friend Michael Chapdelaine. He's the guitar professor at UNM. He was in Europe on a tour, and I like this picture that shows the St. Peter's Square below. The extravagance of the architecture is reflected in the music. For example, here's a picture of elaborate decoration in this melody. Another feature of the Baroque is that not only is the art and the architecture dramatic, but the music is as well. We saw in the Renaissance this awareness of the capacity of art to sway or affect the emotions. This led in the early 17th century to an aesthetic theory called the doctrine of affections. The doctrine of affections held that different musical moods could and should be used to influence the emotions or affections of the listener. In general, each specific work of art in the Baroque confines itself to one basic mood. Imagine that a piece of music is like a pie, and wherever you take a slice from it, it will taste pretty much the same. Here's a couple columns that contrast the Renaissance with the Baroque. As we heard in the Renaissance, the human voice was considered to be superior, and now that we're in the Baroque, you will see how instruments become as important. The Renaissance focused on choral singing, vocal ensembles, where in the Baroque, at least at the beginning, it emphasizes the solo singer. Whereas the a cappella was the ideal in the Renaissance, the solo voice with accompaniment became favored in the Baroque period. One of the big developments that took place going into the Baroque period, it didn't happen overnight, but by the time we get to the middle of the Baroque, it becomes a feature is that modal harmony is replaced with functional harmony, with music that's in a major key or a minor key. As we saw in Chapter 9, the music of the Renaissance was dominated by polyphony, in which the voices spun out a web of imitative counterpoint. The squiggly lines here in this picture show you that each of the lines was equally important. In the Baroque period, the big shift was that the voices were no longer equal. Instead, a polarity developed in which the musical emphasis gravitated toward the top and the bottom parts. The point is that Baroque harmonies were chordally conceived, and they were tightly bound to this system called the basso continuo. The basso continuo was a bass-driven chordal support in Baroque music. It was kind of like jazz in that the basso continuo would provide the accompaniment to the melody. What it's made up of is at least two players. It's a small ensemble of at least two instruments that provides the foundation for Baroque melodies. I mentioned it's kind of like jazz in that the keyboardist that would play one of the parts was only given what's pictured here. They'd be given the bass part, there's the key signature and the time signature, and they would have to figure out what those numbers meant. The basso continuo was made up of usually a cello or a bassoon or a viola da gamba, a bass instrument, plus a keyboard instrument like the harpsichord or the organ. And the keyboardist would provide the foundation for the melody above. You can think of the basso continuo as continuous bass, this set of chords that continuously underlie the melody in a piece of Baroque music. Figured bass is the numerical shorthand that tells the player which unwritten notes to fill in. So this picture on the left shows you the bass line, and the numbers are these figures that kind of give a clue as to what the position of the chord is. For those of you that are interested in theory, what you can do is count the number of steps above the written note and fill in the missing notes of the chord. Anyway, on the right is one possible realization of the figured bass that's given on the left. The bass line was really important in the Baroque period because it provided a foundation for the chords which the keyboardist would fill in, which the keyboardist would play. One of the important keyboard instruments was the harpsichord, and this is its distinctive sound. Next, you'll hear the harpsichord's role as a basso continuo instrument. Listen to the chords that it's playing, cutting through the sound of the orchestra. Here's another great example of the harpsichord's role as a basso continuo instrument. Once again, Baroque harmonies were quarterly conceived and tightly bound to the basso continuo, and eventually the major and minor keys replaced the church modes. Rhythmically speaking, in Baroque music, it's characterized by uniformity, not flexibility. The tendency toward rhythmic clarity and drive becomes more pronounced as the Baroque period proceeds. This is not from the Baroque. Try and tap your foot along with the beat. This is from the Baroque. Notice how the rhythm is much steadier and clearer.